For this tutorial, you'll need your histogram panel open. Go up to Window and choose Histogram. Where is it? Histogram. And I'm going to just dock this up here by clicking and dragging it over till that blue line appears between some windows. This way I have my histogram open, my adjustment panels, and my layers available. So we will adjust this photo to bring back a lot of the light. One of the things that you run into in life is your human eye is a wonderful thing and it can see all sorts of value, but cameras can only capture a portion of that value. So part of the reason we take stuff back into Photoshop is to readjust it so that it shows more of what our eyes actually saw. This is a bit of an extreme example, but it'll give us a chance to play with several things. Now I'm going to show you how to do this with adjustment layers. Yes, you can actually do these adjustments directly to the image itself, but the reason why for the most part we don't do that anymore is because if I came and did this adjustment, which would be levels, so I'm going to go to images and adjustment and choose levels, and if I made that change and hit OK, it would permanently affect those pixels. And if I ever needed to come back and change this file, I couldn't restore it to the original one. That's why we use adjustment layers. So I'm going to hit Command Z and undo that thing I just did and do it this way by coming either down here to the bottom where there's this little circle with a half line through it, clicking and choosing levels, which will throw a adjustment layer above our image layer. I could have done the exact same thing by clicking on the little levels button up here. Now these little images each match one of these things that's listed in this, so whether you want to find it by the name or find it by the button, it really doesn't matter. So let me tell you what a histogram is. A histogram represents the data in your image, and in the Levels histogram, which is popped up here in the Properties panel, it's a little easier to look at because it doesn't have all the funky colors. On a histogram, you have the darkest dark on the left and the lightest light on the right, and this stuff in the middle is the actual colors or the brightness of the image that you're looking at. So it should represent more like a mountain range shape that's flatter and comes over here, but because it's all piled up against one corner, I can tell you one thing that I would know even if I weren't looking at this photo, that this image is really, really dark. And we're going to adjust this so that that data spreads out just a little bit more. Okay, so how do levels work? Well, we've got our white slider here on the right, and very simply if you click on that and drag it to the left, it will adjust that one and the gray one, and you can see a lot of color coming back into this image. Now if I drag it too far, it's going to overexpose. Other terms for that are blowing out or clipping. And you can see where this white becomes, it's called posterized, when it kind of gets chunky and really unattractive. You definitely don't want that in a photo. The beauty thing about using a adjustment layer is it's always adjustable. I can come back at any point and readjust this because the original layer still exists right below it. So I can click and turn this eyeball on and off to see the original layer showing through. So when you are clicking and dragging this very first white one to the left, you want to stop before anything starts clipping out. And even though you can eyeball it pretty good, an even better way to see where pixels might be blowing out is to hold down Option and click and drag that slider. And you see as I drag it more to the left, these white pixels start showing up. Those are the ones that are starting to blow out. So I want to maybe back off just a titch from where that is and let go. Alright, so that's bringing the white in a little bit further. Now if we look up at our histogram over here, you can see it doesn't look like this mountain crammed up against the side quite as much anymore. What it's done is taken that available data and spread it more across the range. So even though any photographer that uses a histogram all day long would tell you this is a terrible looking histogram, it's a lot better than what we started with, which is what we're going for here. The next thing we want to do is maybe bring up some of the darks in our mid-tones. So these mid-tones are represented with this center slider, also known as a gamma slider. We're going to click and drag this one just a little to the left. And again, we're watching for things to blow out, because it can also go wrong if you over adjust it. About there looks good. On many other photographs, especially if it's too light, you would also bring in the dark side of this, the dark side. But obviously this photo has got plenty of blacks in it, and we really don't need to emphasize the blacks any more than we already are. So I'm going to hit Command 0 to fit this image to screen size and take a look at our before and after by clicking the eyeball on and off. That's quite a difference. That's quite a big difference. So Levels is something that's really awesome to work with. Now, the other thing to be aware of when you're taking especially a dark photo and lightening it is at some point you will probably start seeing what's called noise. And if I zoom in, and I can even hold down my spacebar and pan around here, if I zoom in and take a look at the really dark areas on this sculpture's face, I can see kind of speckly, dusty looky bits, and that's noise, and it's an artifact left over from when the picture was taken. And that just will happen. You will see it quite a lot. If you play around with photography a bit, you know way more than I do probably about what causes that. I just know how to correct it a little bit. So we can do a correction for noise, but we have to do it actually to the image. But because we don't want to destroy or permanently alter our original image, we're going to make a copy of this layer by clicking and dragging it down to the new layer icon. And then I'm going to come up to my filter menu and go to noise and choose reduce noise. Now I'm going to warn you already, when this pops up it's going to show the dark version because it'll actually be this picture out here. And I'm going to zoom in maybe even a little bit more so you can see more of how this is affecting the image. So if I uncheck my little preview box, you can see what the original looks like out here. Or if I even click on this in the inside, I can see what the difference is. Now my settings, I have actually cranked a couple of these really, really high because this thing has some strong noise happening in it. So I've set my strength at 10. Preserving details will help it become not too smooth, because part of what this does is takes those really raggedy looking pixels and just softens them just a tiny bit. And I've got reduce color noise cranked all the way up, and I've got sharpen details all the way down to 0. What sharpen details will mostly do is try and find edges and make them more crisp. So if you feel like it's getting a little too mushy, you can crank that up. And I also have remove JPEG artifacting there. And each one of these is just such a subtle change, but if you're watching the image out here you can see it, and then when you click and drag in here you can see how big of a change that will make. So we can click OK and see what that looks like. This layer, it would probably be a good idea to name it, let's say this is noise removal. And as I'm looking at this, flipping that off and on, what I'm seeing is it turned pretty much this whole part of her face to mud. And I really, really don't like that effect. So I can do a couple of things. I can either choose this layer and scale back the opacity just a little bit to let some of that original stuff show through, but it will also let all the other original stuff show through. And this is such a subtle thing, I probably can't even see it. So I can either do that, or I can put the opacity back up high and actually just grab my eraser, and by right clicking I can increase the size and reduce the hardness of the edge of that. This is your instant brush editor that you can get for any of these that act kind of like a brush, and you can do that by right clicking. Now you can pick the brush by clicking down here, but you'll notice all it shows is just the shape of the brush tip. What's more useful is to see the whole stroke of the brush. So pretty much as soon as I open my Photoshop for the first time, I come in here and click on this little gear and say, show me a large stroke thumbnail. Do a stroke thumbnail. So now I can see what I'm really looking at. I want a soft, fuzzy eraser brush. And I can increase my size quite a bit actually. Alrighty. And then in eraser, I don't want to immediately erase everything when I click. So I'm going to come up here to my eraser opacity and turn it down just a little bit. And then if I erase over just a little bit of this area that looked so muddy, it'll bring some of it back. Alright, so that's kind of a subtle thing, definitely not a huge change, but sometimes if you do 3 or 4 subtle changes, it adds up to make quite a difference in the end. So I'm going to hit Command 0 to see the whole thing again. So this is probably about as good as this image gets. Obviously the original had a few issues, but this is considerably improved over what we started with. At this point I have a layered document, and anytime we have a layered document you tend to save those as Photoshop documents. Now if you've ever printed photos, you probably know that your printer is not interested in having your Photoshop document. What they want from you is a flattened JPEG or some other format. But if this is something that I might want to come back and edit, it would be a good idea to save it as a Photoshop document. The other option is to flatten these layers, and then I can just save this over the original, which kind of defeats the purpose of using layers to edit, but you can kind of play around with doing maybe both, of editing an original and saving it, or editing with layers and flattening it, whatever kind of works for you. But this is the way I'm showing you because we'll be using a lot of adjustment layers in the future. So I'm going to save this first, File, Save As, and it's going to be my witch photo, and save. So that's a Photoshop document. And then I want to save a JPEG version. So I'm going to go File and Save As. And if you're one of my students, the JPEG is actually what you'll turn in, so you'll need to give it whatever name that the site asks for, but you just change the format to JPEG and then give it the name it's supposed to have and click Save. So now I have a JPEG version that I could use to take to a printer, and I also still have my Photoshop layered version, so if I wanted to, I could come back and re-edit this at any time. So I know that was kind of a rough and ready introduction to histograms and levels, but hopefully that made a little bit of sense and you got to kind of dabble your toes into the histogram world. I have included a couple of links on the website for much more detailed histogram explanation. So if you're someone that already has a kind of a background that lets you know more about histograms, or if you're interested in learning more, please watch those. There's a great deal in Photoshop that your understanding of how those functions work can be greatly improved by just knowing a little bit more about the histogram.